The mating ceremony was supposed to crown her. Instead, it became the exact moment the Alpha King tore the sacred thread from their souls and left her bleeding on the cold stone. The grand courtyard of the Obsidian Keep of Valdron was built to humble the weak. It was a vast, unforgiving expanse of black marble and towering iron spires, open to the merciless sky of the winter solstice. Tonight, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the bitter chill of impending snow. But it was not snow that fell from the dark heavens. It was ash. Pale, grey flakes drifted down from the ceremonial pyres burning at the four corners of the fortress, settling on the shoulders of the gathered nobility like a shroud. The cold seeped through the soles of Evadne Thorn's thin slippers, biting into her skin, but she did not shiver. Evadne stood pressed against the biting wind, her posture perfectly aligned, her spine straight as a forged blade. She wore the silver silk of a bride, the fabric pooling around her feet in stark contrast to the black stone. Her knuckles were white, where her hands clasped before her, the only visible sign of the violent storm raging within her veins. The entire court watched her. Hundreds of eyes, hungry for her ruin, pinned her to the center of the dais. They expected her to shatter. A heavy, oppressive silence hung over the crowd, thick enough to suffocate. Then he stepped forward. Valerius Draconis possessed a physical presence that devoured the light in a room. The Alpha King was a mountain of lethal muscle and dark armor, moving with the suppressed, predatory grace of a beast that had conquered 7 realms. His crown, forged of raw, unpolished iron, sat heavily upon his dark hair, but it was his eyes that made the court hold its breath. Usually a piercing, clear storm grey that anchored her soul, tonight they were clouded, shifting with a sickly, milky haze. Evadne did not know the man standing before her. She did not know that his blood was currently saturated with the venom of a soul fracture, a toxic elixir housed in a delicate moonstone vial far from the public eye. All she knew was that the golden thread connecting her heart to his was humming with a terrifying, discordant vibration. It felt wrong. Everything felt fundamentally, biologically wrong. Behind the sovereign, half hidden in the shadows of the massive stone pillars, stood Kaelinis Morvath. The advisor was beautiful in the way a winter frost was beautiful, sharp, blinding, and entirely devoid of warmth. She wore elegant garments of pale grey velvet, and even from 10 paces away, the cloying scent of poisoned honey and crushed dark petals drifted from her skin. Lady Morvath watched the altar with a polite, frozen smile. Her hands were folded immaculately beneath her cloak, her chin lifted in quiet triumph. King Valerius stopped 3 feet from Evadne. He did not reach for her. He did not close the distance to press his forehead against hers, as the ancient rites demanded. Instead, his massive hands curled into tight fists at his sides, the leather of his gauntlets creaking loudly in the dead silence of the courtyard. Beneath the thick plates of his armor, the Winterbane brand, a jagged, freezing scar carved into his chest by a generational curse, pulsed with agonizing cold. The sovereign's jaw locked, his chest heaved with a shallow, erratic breath. Evadne of the Thorn lineage, the monarch spoke. His voice was a low, guttural rumble that echoed off the obsidian walls, but it lacked its usual resonance. It sounded hollowed out, scraped raw from the inside. "You stand before the altar of Valdron." Evadne did not flinch. She held his gaze, searching for the lover who had whispered her name. In the quiet dark of the royal library, the mate who had rested his heavy head in her lap when the burdens of the crown became too vast. He was not there. Those familiar irises were locked in a glassy, emotionless stare. His inner beast whimpered a distant, muffled sound in the back of her mind, drowning in an unnatural fog. "I reject this bond." It took 4 words to shatter her world. The physical impact of the rejection was not a metaphor. It was a brutal, biological severing. The sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding, finally snapped. A blinding, searing heat erupted in the center of Evadne's chest, radiating outward like liquid fire. The invisible claiming mark that had begun to form over her heart violently tore itself away, leaving behind a phantom wound that bled agonizing, freezing pain into her lungs. Her breath caught in her throat, her vision greyed at the edges. The physical agony of a torn mate bond was designed to bring wolves to their knees, to make them scream and claw at the dirt in mindless grief. Everyone expected her to weep. They waited for the pitiful collapse of a wolfless healer who had dared to dream above her station, waiting for her to crawl across the ash-covered stone and beg for his mercy. Evadne refused to break. She inhaled a sharp, freezing breath of the ozone-laced air, forcing the oxygen into her burning lungs. She tightened the muscles in her legs, locking her knees to remain standing. She lifted her chin, exposing the long, pale line of her neck to the falling ash. Her silver eyes, clear and unblinking, met the clouded gaze of the king. She saw the violent flinch in his broad shoulders as the bond snapped. She saw the way his iron-clad fingers dug into his own palms until the leather stretched. He was bleeding from the inside out, yet he stood entirely rigid, entirely lost. I accept. 2 words, spoken with a quiet, devastating calm that carried across the silent courtyard, ringing louder than a war horn. The frozen smile on Lady Morveith's face faltered for a fraction of a second. The matriarch's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine irritation breaking through her carefully constructed mask. This was not the script. The outcast was supposed to break. She was supposed to show the court exactly why she was unfit to wear the lunar crown. Instead, the rejected mate stood like a sovereign in her own right, her dignity an impenetrable shield against their mockery. Evadne did not look at the advisor. She did not look at the whispering nobles. She kept her eyes solely on Valerius. For a singular heartbeat, the milky haze in the king's eyes parted. A flash of pure, unadulterated terror crossed his rugged features. His hand twitched, lifting a fraction of an inch toward her, as if a buried instinct was screaming at him to pull her back, to shield her from the very words he had just spoken. But the poison was too strong. The fog rolled back in, drowning his true wolf in darkness. Evadne took a single step backward. The ash crunched beneath her thin slipper. She gathered the heavy silver silk of her ceremonial gown in her scarred hands, hands that had spent years grinding medicinal herbs, binding wounds, and quietly healing the broken things of this fortress. With flawless, agonizing grace, she sank into a deep, formal curtsy. She bowed her head to the sovereign who had just destroyed her. Then she turned and walked away into the dark. She did not run. She did not look back. The heavy iron doors of the courtyard loomed ahead, and she moved toward them with measured, deliberate steps. Behind her, the oppressive silence of the court finally shattered into a cacophony of murmurs, but it was nothing compared to the deafening roar of the shattered connection echoing in her skull. Every step felt like walking on shattered glass. Her chest burned with a hollow, freezing ache, a void where her anchor had once been. The ash continued to fall, burying the exact spot where her future had died. She took the first corridor left. A serving boy, with a tray of empty wine cups, stared at her open-mouthed, dropping a silver goblet that clattered loudly against the stone. She did not stop. She took the second corridor right, moving past a grand tapestry of the founding wolves that was older than her grandfather, descending a narrow flight of servant stairs that she had to take in one fluid stride to keep her momentum. The shadows of the dark citadel swallowed her whole, wrapping around her like a cold, familiar cloak. Evadne knew the execution orders would follow. The matriarch would not allow a rejected mate to linger and become a symbol of pity or a political liability. The formal rejection was merely the public spectacle. The quiet dagger in the dark would come before sunrise. She had to disappear. The air grew significantly colder as she descended into the lower levels of the fortress. The walls here were rough-hewn stone, damp with condensation, and smelling strongly of wet earth and old iron. The ambient temperature dropped, sending a physical shock through her shivering frame. She wrapped her arms around her torso, pressing her palms against the phantom wound on her chest. The burning sensation was slowly giving way to a terrifying, spreading numbness. Her wolfless biology was struggling to process the trauma of the severed thread. She reached the heavy wooden door that led to the postern gate the eastern boundary wall that separated the keep from the deadly, untamed expanse of the whispering frostwoods. The latch was freezing to the touch. She grabbed the rusted iron ring, pulling with all her remaining strength. The door groaned open, revealing the absolute blackness of the northern night. A shadow detached itself from the stone wall. Evadne froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She braced herself, ready to fight, ready to use the absolute last reserve of her physical strength. But the figure did not draw a weapon. Instead, a familiar, earthy scent washed over her, clove dried sage, and the sharp tang of medicinal alcohol. It was Gideon Vance. The royal healer stood quietly in the biting wind, his face obscured by the heavy hood of a traveller's cloak. He was a man who lived his life in the margins of the court, a quiet observer who noticed everything and said very little. His hands, stained permanently with the juices of bitter roots and potent apothecaries, held a massive bundle of heavy furs and a tightly packed leather satchel. "You are a fool for walking so slowly, Evadne," Gideon said softly. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness in his throat, a roughness that betrayed the deep, fatherly affection he held for the outcast girl who had spent countless hours assisting him in the infirmary. "I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a chase," she replied, her voice trembling for the first time since the altar. She swallowed hard, forcing the weakness down. Gideon stepped forward, moving with urgent efficiency. He did not ask questions. He did not offer empty condolences about the Alpha King's sudden, horrific betrayal. He knew the politics of the High Court better than anyone, and he knew the lethal ambition of Lady Morveth. Without a word, he draped a massive fur-lined winter cloak over Evadne's trembling shoulders, covering the thin, impractical silver silk of her gown. The sudden weight and warmth of the garment was a physical shock, grounding her instantly in the reality of her survival. "Take this," the older man instructed, shoving the heavy leather satchel into her arms. "There is dried meat, high country bread, and enough fire starters to get you through the first 3 nights. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, are 3 vials of wolfsbane extract. Use them to mask your scent along the riverbed. Your natural aroma of moonflowers is too distinct. The trackers will be out before dawn." Evadne clutched the satchel to her chest, her scarred fingers gripping the thick leather. The warmth radiating from the healer's hands was the only tether keeping her from floating away into the freezing void of her broken bond. "Gideon, why are you doing this? If the advisor finds out you helped me, she will have you hanged from the highest spire." The matriarch is a creature of poison and paranoia, the royal healer stated flatly, his dark eyes scanning the courtyard behind them for any sign of movement. She believes she has won tonight. She believes she has secured the lineage of Valdron by excising the weak. But I have studied the ancient texts, child. I know the truth of the fated threads. What was done up there on that altar was an abomination against the moon goddess. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently gripping her shoulder, giving her a firm, anchoring squeeze. "You must run. You must cross the frozen river and disappear into the deep woods where the royal patrols do not dare to tread, and you must never, ever return." Evadne looked out into the yawning abyss of the whispering frostwoods. The trees were massive, twisted silhouettes against the snow-covered earth, their branches groaning under the weight of the ice. It was a landscape designed to kill. To step into it was to embrace a brutal, solitary existence. But it was also a place where the reach of the Iron Crown could not strangle her. A sudden, sharp cramp seized her lower abdomen, causing her to double over with a quiet gasp. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hand hard against her stomach beneath the heavy furs. The sensation was fleeting, but it was enough to send a jolt of pure, instinctual panic through her nervous system. She was not just running for her own life. The secret she carried, a truth she had planned to whisper to Valerius tonight in the warmth of their private chambers, was now the most dangerous liability in the realm. She carried the true heir of an ancient royal lineage and the blood of the Alpha King. If Lady Morveth even suspected, there would be no corner of the continent safe from the hunters. Gideon noticed the protective gesture. His sharp eyes dropped to her stomach, and a profound, solemn understanding passed between them. The old man did not gasp or ask for confirmation. He simply reached into his own tunic and pulled out a small, unadorned silver dagger, pressing the hilt into her free hand. "The woods are cruel, but they do not lie," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Survive, Evadne. Let the cold make you unbreakable. We are small things in a world of teeth, but even the smallest things can learn how to bite back." "Thank you, Gideon," she breathed, her voice a fragile wisp of vapor in the freezing air. "Go now." Evadne turned away from the only father figure she had ever known. She pulled the heavy fur hood over her dark hair, hiding the striking silver of her eyes, and stepped off the stone path onto the frozen earth. The crunch of the snow beneath her boots was deafening in the silence of the night. She moved quickly, her survival instincts taking over, forcing the agonizing grief of the severed mark into a dark, locked box in the back of her mind. The whispering frostwoods were not merely a forest. They were a graveyard of ancient, twisted pines suffocating beneath centuries of unyielding ice. The wind shrieked through the barren branches like a chorus of grieving women, biting through the thick furs Gideon had provided. Evadne walked. She did not stop when her calves cramped. She did not stop when the phantom wound over her heart, throbbed with a hollow, freezing agony that made her vision swim. She plunged deeper into the tree line, the shadows of the wilderness rising up to greet her, ancient and indifferent. The scent of pine and freezing sap overwhelmed the lingering metallic tang of the keep. She had to cross the river. The royal trackers would release the hounds before dawn. The river was a jagged scar of black water cutting through the valley, bordered by treacherous shelves of ice. The water was lethal. To step into it was to invite a freezing death. Evadne did not hesitate. She unwrapped the first vial of wolfsbane extract. The liquid was thick and smelled of bitter earth and rot. She poured it over her thin slippers and the hem of her gown, rubbing the toxic sap into the fabric with her numb, scarred fingers. Then she stepped into the water. The cold was a physical blow. It punched the breath from her lungs. The freezing current wrapped around her calves, sinking its teeth into her skin. But as the dark water threatened to drag her under, a strange, latent warmth began to pulse from her center. It did not come from the severed mate bond. It came from the life growing in her womb. Her hidden ancient bloodline, old and unyielding, flared to life beneath her skin, pushing back the lethal frost just enough to keep her heart beating. With every step through the black current, the golden thread that had once connected her to the throne stretched, faded, and vanished like smoke through a crack in the world. The rejected mate disappeared into the snow, leaving nothing behind but absolute deafening silence. She waded up the riverbed for 3 brutal miles. By the time she pulled herself onto the northern bank, her lips were blue, and her body was shaking uncontrollably. But her scent was gone. The moonflower aroma was washed away, replaced by the sterile bite of winter water and wolfsbane. She found the cabin on the 3rd day. It was of a forgotten trapper's shelter, half buried in the snow, at the base of a jagged ridge. The roof sagged under the weight of the winter, and the heavy wooden door hung crooked on rusted iron hinges. But it was empty, it was hidden, and it had a deep stone hearth. Evadne collapsed onto the dusty floorboards. She used the fire starters Gideon had packed, striking the flint with trembling hands until a spark caught the dry moss she had gathered. The small fire flickered to life, casting golden embers against the dark walls, pushing back the crystalline frost webs that clung to the timber. She curled into a tight ball before the hearth, pulling the heavy furs over her shivering frame. She pressed her hand to her stomach. "We are alive," she whispered to the empty room. "We are alive." Then the exhaustion claimed her, pulling her down into a dreamless, freezing dark. 6 months passed. The whispering frostwoods did not kill her. Instead, they taught her how to become a ghost. Evadne Thorn transformed the ruined cabin into a sanctuary of dried herbs, hanging roots, and bundled sage. She traded medicinal salves and poultices, with the villagers who lived on the rugged fringes of the woods. They did not ask questions. They did not care about the striking silver eyes of the quiet woman in grey, nor did they notice the latent ancient magic she subtly used to mend their broken bones and soothe their fevers. To them, she was simply the healer, a solitary woman with a heavily swollen belly and a straight, unyielding spine. She had built a quiet life out of the ashes, but the severed thread still bled. Every night, when the silver moon rose high above the canopy, the phantom scar on her chest would ache. It was a dull, persistent throbbing, a biological reminder of the man who had cast her away. She did not know that across the continent, within the black stone walls of his ancestral home, the Alpha King was dying. Valerius Draconis had torn his own castle apart. The soul fracture poison had finally burned out of his bloodstream 3 days after the winter solstice. When the milky haze cleared from his storm-grey eyes, the absolute horror of what he had done crushed him. He had stood at the grand altar and banished his true mate. The golden thread was gone, leaving behind an agonizing void where his soul had once been. The Winterbane brand, a physical, freezing scar on King Valerius's chest that burned with excruciating frost, now bled every time the moon rose. He fell to his knees on the black stone floor of his private chambers, his massive hands clutching the jagged mark as the cold consumed him. The realization clawed at his throat, suffocating him. He had been poisoned. The toxic elixir from the moonstone vial had twisted his wolf's protective instincts into a devastating act of banishment, blinding him to the truth. Now he was entirely alone, trapped in a fortress of ice, dying from a generational curse that only her touch could have cured. Valerius Draconis threw his head back and unleashed a roar of pure, unadulterated agony. The sound shattered the stained glass windows of the high tower, echoing out over the snow-covered valley. He had to find her. He would tear apart the 7 realms. He would crawl on his bleeding knees across the whispering frostwoods to beg for her forgiveness. But as he stared out into the endless expanse of the northern night, the bitter wind offered no scent, no trace, no hope. His true mate was gone, and every moonrise would be a brutal, suffocating reminder of his mistake. The first major full moon since the winter solstice hung over the shadow-drenched fortress of Valdron like the curved blade of an executioner's axe. It bathed the high towers in a sickly, pale luminescence, casting elongated shadows across the black marble courtyards. Inside the sovereign's private chambers, the ambient temperature had plummeted to unnatural, lethal lows. The hearth fires had been suffocated by the sheer force of the magic radiating from the center of the room. Spidery patterns of ice crawled up the heavy velvet tapestries, freezing the rich fabric into rigid, shattering sheets of glass. King Valerius lay in the center of the massive, iron-wrought bed, his body rigid and trembling violently. He was restrained. By his own command, thick iron chains bound his wrists to the heavy bedposts. It was an act of extreme self-restraint, a desperate measure to keep his feral, grief-maddened inner wolf from tearing through the keep to hunt for a scent that was no longer there. His physical presence, usually a terrifying manifestation of absolute authority, was entirely subdued by the agonizing biological reality of the severed bond. The moment the moonlight breached the high-arched windows and touched his bare skin, the Winterbane brand activated with catastrophic intensity. The curse was a jagged, horrific scar carved over his heart, a generational punishment inflicted upon the Draconis bloodline. Usually, it was a dormant, dull ache, easily managed by the proximity of his fated mate. Tonight, without the stabilizing anchor of Avadna's soul thread, the brand erupted. A physical, crackling layer of white frost bloomed outward from the scar, sinking deep into his pectoral muscles and creeping up the thick cords of his neck. It burned. It was an excruciating, searing agony that felt like dry ice pressed directly against exposed nerves. His veins turned black against his pale skin, pumping a slush of frozen blood through his failing heart. Valerius gritted his teeth, his jaw locking so hard the bones popped in the silent room. A low, guttural snarl vibrated in his chest, tearing at his throat. His pale irises were blown wide. The pupils dilated until they were nearly solid black, shifting frantically as his inner beast whimpered in the dark. The wolf was dying. It was suffocating in the violent void left by the torn mark. Every instinct screamed for the aroma of moonflowers, for the quiet, calloused hands that used to press against his chest and absorb the cold. But there was only the biting winter air. The heavy oak doors of the chamber groaned open, shattering the isolation. Caolenus Morveth stepped over the threshold, pulling the thick fur lining of her pale grey velvet cloak tighter around her throat. The matriarch did not shiver, though the air in the room was cold enough to freeze water mid-spill. She moved with a calculated, elegant grace, her sharp face beautiful in the way a winter frost was beautiful, immaculate, blinding, and entirely devoid of compassion. The cloying scent of poisoned honey and crushed, dark petals rolled off her, a suffocating perfume designed to mask the rot of her ambition. She approached the bed, her eyes sweeping over the chained, trembling monarch with a look of polite, clinical detachment. In her hands, she carried a silver basin etched with high-born runes and a handful of rare, glowing embers harvested from the deep volcanic vents of the Eastern Territories. "The court hears your roars, my king," Lady Morveth stated softly, her voice a smooth, practiced murmur. "They whisper of a madness taking hold of the crown. We cannot allow the lesser houses to see their sovereign, brought low by the absence of a wolfless maid." Valerius strained against the iron chains. The metal links groaned in protest, biting into the flesh of his wrists until a thin line of raw blood trickled down his forearms. He did not speak. He could not form words through the suffocating grip of the freeze. He simply stared at her, his stormy irises practically vibrating with a mixture of absolute hatred and feral desperation. He knew she was the architect of his ruin. He remembered the milky haze of the soul fracture poison taking hold of his mind before the rejection. But right now, his body was a prison, and he was entirely incapacitated by the curse she had unleashed. "I have brought the high magic of the lunar ascendants," she continued, setting the basin on the bedside table. "The ancient texts swear that volcanic ash and blood magic can simulate the warmth of a true mate. It will thaw the winterbane. It will restore your strength." Lady Morveth dipped her immaculate, unscarred hands into the glowing embers, her fingers protected by a shimmering barrier of protective spellwork. She began a low, rhythmic incantation, her voice weaving through the freezing air like a venomous snake. The magic flared to life, a brilliant, unnatural blue light that illuminated the dark stone of the chamber. She leaned over the writhing king, aiming the concentrated heat directly at the jagged frost of the winterbane brand. The moment her high-born magic made contact with his cursed skin, the reaction was explosive. The winterbane did not thaw. It violently rejected the artificial warmth. A shockwave of pure abyssal cold blasted outward from Valerius's chest, shattering the magical barrier around Morveth's hands in an instant. The matriarch gasped, a sharp, undignified sound of genuine pain, as the frost bit deeply into her fingers, instantly turning her pristine skin a necrotic black. She stumbled backward, dropping the silver basin. It clattered loudly against the floor, the volcanic embers hissing and dying the second they touched the frozen stone. "Impossible," Lady Morveth breathed, clutching her ruined hand to her chest. Her polite, frozen smile was completely obliterated by terror. The texts, the high magic should have. Valerius let out a breath that clouded the air with thick white vapor. He stared at the ceiling, the agonizing physical burning in his chest, somehow dwarfed by the crushing psychological weight of his realization. He looked at the matriarch, watching her tremble in pain from a mere fraction of the curse he endured every second. This was the scale of his mistake. He had allowed his court, his advisors, and his own poisoned mind to convince him that Everne Thorn was weak. He had believed the whispers that a wolfless healer with scarred hands was unfit to sit beside a king who carried the winterbane. He had cast her out to protect the kingdom's image, blinded by the forced mind control of the Moonstone Vial. Yet, here was Caolenus Morveth, the most powerful magic wielder in the Seven Keeps, brought to her knees by a single touch of his skin. Evadne had never worn protective spellwork. She had never chanted highborn runes. For 3 years before the rejection, the silent maid had simply placed her bare, calloused hand over his heart, absorbing the lethal frost with nothing but the quiet, enduring strength of her hidden ancient blood. No woman ever survived him. No healer in the realm could touch his chest without screaming. Only Evadne. She was not the weak link in his armor. She had been the only thing keeping him alive. "Get out," Valerius rumbled. The words were a low, demonic scrape of sound, barely human. The iron chains rattled as he clenched his fists, his muscles bulging against the restraints. "Get out of my sight." Lady Morveth did not argue. The sharp, confident advisor scrambled backward, her composure in ruins, and fled through the heavy oak doors, leaving the king to his solitary agony. Alone in the dark, Valerius closed his eyes. The phantom wound of the broken tether throbbed in time with his failing heart. He had torn the sacred thread woven between their souls. He had stood at the altar and declared her unworthy. Now he was trapped in an absolute freezing hell of his own making, and every pulse of the curse was a brutal reminder that he had thrown away the only salvation the moon goddess had ever offered him. Deep within the unforgiving heart of the whispering frostwoods, the concept of time was measured not by clocks, but by the accumulation of ice. It was a landscape built on silence and survival. The winter wind howled endlessly through the jagged peaks, carrying with it a bite so sharp it could snap a dry branch in half. Inside the forgotten trapper's cabin, the temperature was barely tolerable, but to Evadne Thorn it was a sanctuary. The ambient geometry of the small room was defined by the glowing stone hearth. The fire was kept low, fed by dry moss and dead pine, casting heavy, golden embers that pushed back the suffocating darkness outside. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, dried sage, and the sharp, medicinal tang of crushed yarrow. Evadne sat on a low wooden stool near the fire, her posture perfectly aligned, her spine straight as a forged blade. She was focused entirely on her task. In her right hand, she held the silver dagger Gideon had given her on the night of her exile. The blade caught the firelight as she meticulously sliced dried wolfsbane root into thin, even strips to mask her scent. Her hands, already scarred from years of labor in the obsidian keep, were now chapped and red from the brutal cold, but her movements were flawless. She was heavily pregnant now. The physical weight of the child she carried was immense, pulling at her lower back and exhausting her wolfless biology. Yet the pregnancy was also her absolute shield. The life growing in her womb possessed a strange, latent alpha magic that radiated a subtle internal heat. It was a warmth that flowed through her veins, combating the freezing drafts that leaked through the cabin's timber walls. She was a vessel for an ancient, unyielding bloodline, and she guarded it with the fierce, silent vigilance of a cornered wolf. Suddenly, a sound shattered the quiet domestic rhythm. It was not the wind. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of a boot breaking through the packed snow outside the eastern window. Evadne froze. Her silver eyes darted toward the heavy wooden door. She did not panic. She did not gasp. In one fluid motion, she set the wooden cutting board aside, extinguished the main oil lantern, and pressed her back against the rough-hewn logs beside the doorframe. She flipped the silver dagger in her hand, the blade pointing downward in a lethal, defensive grip. She slowed her breathing, silencing the frantic rhythm of her heart, becoming nothing more than a shadow in the corner of the room. 3 quick taps sounded against the thick wood, then 2 slow ones. The tension drained from Evadne's shoulders, though she did not lower the blade. She reached out with her free hand, pulling the heavy iron latch back, and opened the door a fraction of an inch. The biting wind rushed in, followed immediately by Gideon Vance. The royal healer slipped through the narrow opening, quickly shoving the door shut behind him and dropping the heavy wooden crossbar into place. He was covered in a thick layer of snow, his face obscured by a rugged fur hood that contrasted sharply with the fine, dark-aught robes of his station hidden beneath. He was shivering violently, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You took a monumental risk coming here, Gideon," Evadne stated softly. her voice carrying a quiet authority that belonged to a queen, not an outcast. She moved to the hearth, immediately pouring a cup of boiling water over a bundle of dried pine needles, offering it to the older man. "The risk of staying ignorant is far greater," Gideon rasped, taking the tin cup with trembling hands. He let the heat seep into his palms before pulling back his hood. He looked older, his face lined with deep exhaustion, his dark eyes shadowed by the stress of navigating a crumbling court. He dropped a heavy leather satchel onto the small wooden table. "I brought high country bread, iron supplements for the child, and fresh bandages. The villages on the fringe are being watched by Morvath's hounds. You cannot trade there anymore." Evadne accepted the news with a slow, stoic nod. She did not complain about the tightening noose of her isolation. She simply walked to the table and began unpacking the supplies, organizing them with practiced efficiency. "Is the matriarch looking for me?" "The matriarch is looking for a scapegoat," Gideon corrected, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. He watched Evadne carefully, tracking the subtle, instinctual way she kept one hand resting near her swollen stomach. "The Obsidian Keep is falling apart, Evadne. The pack is decaying, and the Alpha King, Valerius, is dying." Evadne's hands paused over a wrapped bundle of dried meat. For a fraction of a second, the phantom scar over her heart throbbed, a brutal, burning spike of pain that radiated into her lungs. Her latent bond, though severed, still echoed the biological agony of her fated mate. She forced her expression to remain entirely blank. She slowly resumed unpacking. "The Winterbane," she said simply, her tone devoid of inflection. "It is consuming him," Gideon confirmed, leaning forward, the firelight casting harsh shadows across his face. "The curse has advanced beyond anything the medical texts describe. Without the stabilizing presence of your soul thread, his body is freezing from the inside out. He is chained to his own bed to prevent his beast from slaughtering the guards. He howls at the moon, Evadne. He tore the royal chambers apart, searching for a scent he himself banished." Evadne placed the last bundle on the shelf. She turned to face the healer, her silver eyes reflecting the golden embers of the hearth. There were no tears on her face. There was no wavering in her posture. "He made his choice at the grand altar," she replied, her voice as hard and unyielding as cold iron. "He stood before the entire realm and tore the sacred thread. I accepted his decree. I will not undo it simply because the consequences of his actions are finally burning him." "He was poisoned," Gideon hissed, stepping forward, his desperation bleeding through his courtly restraint. "I found the evidence, Evadne." The Moonstone Vial in Morvath's private study. She dosed him with a soul fracture potion just hours before the ceremony. It blinded his wolf. It forced his mind into a state of absolute paranoia. He believed you were a threat to the kingdom. He rejected you to protect the throne, but his human mind was entirely suppressed by the venom. The revelation hung in the heavy, smoke-filled air. Evadne stared at the crackling fire. The heavy, dramatic irony of her situation settled over her shoulders. The man she loved had not betrayed her out of malice, but out of a chemically induced, twisted need to protect his realm. The arrogance of the sovereign, manipulated by the cold ambition of a royal advisor. Everyone would expect her to shatter at this news, to weep for the tragedy of it all, to gather her cloak, and rush back through the snow to save the dying king. Evadne didn't. She lifted her chin, her hand coming to rest firmly against the heavy curve of her stomach. The child kicked, a strong, vibrant thud against her palm. "It does not matter," Evadne said, quietly, the absolute finality in her tone causing Gideon to fall silent. A king who allows his mind to be so easily corrupted by those in his inner circle is a king who cannot protect a family. I am no longer a maid seeking a crown. I am a mother, and my child will not be born into a fortress built on poison and lies. She picked up the silver dagger, turning her attention back to the wolfsbane root. "I will survive the frost, Gideon. But Valerius must survive his own court. If he cannot break the ice he allowed them to build around him, then he is already a ghost." The royal archives of the royal citadel were located far beneath the main courtyards, a labyrinth of subterranean vaults, carved directly into the bedrock of the mountain. It was a place designed to preserve the history of the Draconis bloodline, yet it smelled only of decay. The air was heavy with the scent of brittle parchment, dried ink, and the metallic tang of freezing stone. No hearth fires were permitted here. The only light came from the sputtering glow of oil lanterns mounted on rusted iron brackets, casting long, warped shadows across the ancient dust-covered texts. King Valerius moved through the narrow aisles like a phantom of his former self. His massive frame, usually wrapped in pristine dark armor, was clad only in a simple linen tunic and leather breeches. The Winterbane brand pulsed beneath the fabric, an erratic, freezing heartbeat that radiated waves of dry cold into the stagnant air. With every step, a fine mist of frost bloomed on the stone floor beneath his boots. He was dying. His internal temperature was dropping steadily, without the anchoring warmth of his true mate, but the physical agony only sharpened his lethal focus. He stopped before a heavy iron-bound door at the end of the deepest corridor. It bore the intricate silver crest of the matriarch's lineage. Valerius did not ask for the key. He reached out with his bare hands, his fingers wrapping around the frozen iron lock. The metal shrieked as he applied absolute, unforgiving pressure. The intricate mechanism shattered, the lock snapping like brittle bone in his grip. He pushed the heavy oak door open, ignoring the sharp shards of metal that bit into his raw palms. The private study of Caelenus Morveth was meticulously organized, a perfect reflection of her cold, calculating mind. The sovereign bypassed the stacks of tax ledgers and territorial treaties, moving directly to a hidden compartment he had smelled beneath the floorboards. His inner wolf, though weakened and suffocating under the curse, possessed senses that no high-born magic could fully obscure. The faint, lingering aroma of poisoned honey and crushed dark petals clung to the wood, a sickening signature of the advisor's secret presence. He ripped the thick floorboard up with a single violent pull. Inside lay a velvet-lined box. Valerius pulled it out, his breath forming thick white clouds as he opened the lid. There were no poisons left inside. The royal healer had already secured the empty moonstone vial. But there was something far more insidious nestled in the dark fabric. Letters. The king picked up the top parchment. It was a missive addressed to a rival alpha of the Eastern Territories, offering the military secrets of Valdron in exchange for safe harbor. At the bottom of the page, signed in a delicate looping script, was the name Ivadne Thorn. Valerius stared at the signature. For a moment the ambient temperature in the vault plummeted so drastically that the oil in the nearby lantern froze solid, plunging the corner into sudden, stark shadows. He remembered this exact letter. He remembered Lady Morveth presenting it to him in the weeks leading up to the winter solstice. It had been the first seed of doubt, the initial crack in his trust that the matriarch had expertly exploited before administering the soul fracture potion. But looking at it now, with his mind entirely cleared of the venomous haze, the absolute absurdity of the forgery struck him like a physical blow to the chest. Ivadne's hands were heavily scarred from years of grinding medicinal roots and washing raw blood from the keep's floors. She did not write in delicate, flowing strokes. Her handwriting was jagged, practical and uneven, the script of a woman who held a quill the exact same she held a scalpel. This was a flawless, aristocratic imitation. It was the handwriting of a courtier, not a survivalist. The ink pooled lightly at the edges, lacking the heavy, deliberate pressure that marked his mate's true script. Beneath the forged treason were ledgers detailing massive gold payments to the underground apothecaries, specifically requesting the acquisition of the rare, mind-altering ingredients required to brew the soul fracture. The paper trail was absolute. The betrayal was complete. Valerius crushed the forged letter in his massive fist. The parchment crumbled into dry, lifeless flakes. The devastation he had felt at the altar was nothing compared to the apocalyptic fury that now consumed his inner beast. He had allowed this woman to manipulate his deepest protective instincts. He had allowed her to weaponize his sacred duty to the realm against the only soul who had ever offered him true peace. He turned on his heel and left the archives, ascending the dark stone stairwell toward the upper levels of the keep. His footfalls were heavy, rhythmic strikes that echoed ominously through the desolate corridors. The High Council chamber of Valdron was a vast circular room dominated by a massive obsidian table. Above, a grand chandelier of raw iron and pale crystal cast a cold, unforgiving light over the gathered nobility. The atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The lesser lords shifted nervously in their high-backed chairs, murmuring quietly about the erratic weather and the king's uncharacteristic absence. At the head of the table, standing exactly where the sovereign should be, was Caelanis Morveth. The matriarch wore her usual elegant garments of pale grey velvet, but her posture was unusually stiff. Her right hand was heavily bandaged in thick white linen, entirely hidden beneath the heavy folds of her cloak. She was in the midst of delivering a calculated address, her voice smooth and venomous, attempting to consolidate her authority, while the king was supposedly incapacitated by his grief. "The crown is vulnerable," she was saying, her sharp eyes sweeping over the silent lords. "The Alpha King's mind remains fractured by the loss of the wolfless maid. We must prepare to establish a regency council to govern the territories until he—" The heavy double doors of the council chamber exploded inward. The solid oak panels shattered off their iron hinges, crashing onto the polished marble floor with a deafening roar. A blast of freezing air swept into the room, instantly extinguishing half the candles on the chandelier. The temperature plummeted, and the collective breath of the nobility turned to white vapor. King Valerius stepped over the splintered wood. He did not look like a grieving, broken monarch. He looked like the god of winter incarnate. The Winterbane brand pulsed visibly through the thin linen of his tunic, casting a sickly, icy blue glow against his pale skin. His sharp gaze was terrifyingly clear, locked onto the advisor with the singular, lethal focus of a predator about to snap the neck of its prey. The council lords scrambled to their feet, knocking over their heavy chairs in their haste to bow, but the Alpha ignored them completely. He walked slowly toward the head of the obsidian table. Every step left a faint imprint of frost on the marble. Lady Morveth's polite frozen smile finally broke. The color drained from her immaculate face, leaving her looking as brittle as the parchment in the archives. She took a panicked step backward, instinctively clutching her rotting, bandaged hand to her chest. "My king," she stammered, her voice completely losing its practiced cadence. "You should be in your chambers, the curse." Valerius reached the table. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He reached into his breeches and pulled out the handful of forged letters and the apothecary ledgers, tossing them onto the polished black stone. They slid across the sleek surface, coming to a dead stop inches from Morveth's trembling fingers. "You are very thorough, Caelanis," the sovereign stated. His voice was a low, guttural rumble that vibrated in the chests of every lord in the room. It was the voice of the executioner. "You drafted the treason. You paid for the venom. You poured the soul fracture into my goblet while smiling at my face. You orchestrated the ruin of my fated bond to preserve your own miserable lineage." The matriarch stared at the papers. The irrefutable proof of her treason lay exposed before the entire court. She opened her mouth to speak, to weave another intricate lie, but the absolute, crushing pressure of the king's aura forced the air from her lungs. "She was a threat to the realm," she shrieked suddenly, her composure shattering into desperate hysteria. "A wolfless nothing. She would have given you weak heirs. I did what was necessary to protect the Draconis crown." Valerius closed the distance between them in a blur of unnatural speed. He did not strike her. He did not need to. He simply stopped inches from her face, his massive frame towering over her trembling form. The lethal cold radiating from his chest slammed into her like a physical wall. Morvath gasped, the frost biting into her lungs. "You did not protect my crown," Valerius whispered, the softness of his tone far more terrifying than a roar. "You broke it, and you broke the only woman who ever knew how to hold my monstrous soul without bleeding." He turned slightly, addressing the petrified council lords without taking his eyes off the traitor. Caelennis Morvuth is stripped of all titles, lands, and privileges within the realm of Valdrun, the Alpha commanded, his voice echoing with absolute, unyielding authority. Her name is struck from the archives. She is banished from this stronghold, effective immediately. The woman let out a choked sob, falling to her knees on the frozen marble. Valerius, please. The wilderness will kill me. The winter. You will walk out the eastern gates without a cloak, without provisions, and without an escort, the king continued, utterly devoid of mercy. You will experience the exact same mercy you showed my mate. If you are found within my borders by sunrise, you will be hunted not as a noble, but as a rogue. He looked down at the shivering, broken figure at his feet. The elegant, untouchable advisor was gone, replaced by a terrified creature clutching a rotting hand. "Take her away," he ordered. Two heavily armored guards stepped forward instantly, gripping the disgraced noble by her arms and dragging her, screaming and pleading, from the high council chamber. The heavy wooden doors were hauled back into place by the remaining sentries, sealing the room in a deathly silence. Valerius braced his hands against the edge of the obsidian table, his head bowing as a violent spasm of pain tore through his chest. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, and the curse was rushing back in to fill the void. He had delivered his justice, but it brought him no peace. The throne room was secure. The traitor was banished, but his private chambers were still agonizingly empty. He pushed himself off the table, ignoring the horrified stares of his lords. He had one more confrontation left in this fortress. He needed to find the only man who knew the absolute truth. The royal infirmary was located in the southern wing of the keep, a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive architecture of the main fortress. The air here was warm and sterile, saturated with the pungent aromas of medicinal alcohol, dried clove, crushed sage, and the sharp bite of ozone. It was a space dedicated entirely to preservation and healing, a quiet sanctuary that Evadne Thorn had once treated as her true home. When Valerius entered the infirmary, the subtle warmth of the room seemed to recoil from his presence. The frost clinging to his boots hissed violently against the heated stone tiles. He moved with a slow, deliberate heaviness, his massive body fighting a losing battle against the biological deterioration caused by the severed mark. At the far end of the long room, standing before a massive wall of glass apothecaries and grinding mortars, was Gideon Vance. The royal healer did not flinch when the sovereign walked in. He continued to systematically grind a bowl of dried yarrow root, the rhythmic scrape of the stone pestle the only sound in the tense silence. Gideon was a man who had spent his entire life observing the brutal politics of the wolves, and he possessed a quiet, unyielding spine that could not be broken by mere intimidation. Valerius stopped a few paces away. He stared at the old man's back, his storm-grey eyes tracking the steady movement of the healer's scarred hands. "The matriarch has been banished to the ice," the king stated. His voice was rough, scraping painfully against his throat. The archives yielded her forged ledgers. Her treason is exposed. Gideon did not stop grinding the herbs. "Justice is a cold meal, my king. It rarely fills the stomach." The Alpha's jaw locked. He took a step closer, the lethal chill radiating from the Winterbane brand, causing the glass vials on the nearest shelf to rattle and crack under the sudden temperature drop. "Do not play courtly games with me, Gideon. I do not have the time, and my beast does not have the patience." The older man finally set the pestle down. He turned slowly, wiping his hands on a clean linen cloth. He looked at the towering, terrifying monarch, and he did not see a king. He saw a dying, desperate animal. The jagged scar over Valerius's heart was visible through the thin tunic, pulsing with a necrotic, icy blue light that was slowly spreading toward his major arteries. "I am not playing games, Valerius," Gideon said, his tone entirely devoid of the usual formal deference. "I am simply stating a medical fact. You excised the rot from your counsel, but you cannot excise the frost from your veins. Where is she?" The question was not a roar, but a desperate, shattered plea. Valerius closed the remaining distance, his massive hands gripping the edge of the wooden counter so tightly the heavy timber splintered beneath his fingers. He loomed over the royal healer, his chest heaving with shallow, freezing breaths. "I know you helped her escape," the king rumbled, his eyes burning with frantic intensity. "I know she would not have survived the river without your wolfsbane extracts. I know you know exactly where she is hiding. Tell me." Gideon met the Alpha's gaze without blinking. "And if I do, what then? Will you dispatch your royal guard to drag her back in chains? Will you force her into a carriage and lock her in your chambers so she can absorb your pain again? She is not a poultice to be applied to your wounds, my king. She is a woman who was broken at the altar." Valerius flinched violently, stepping backward as if physically struck by the words. The phantom wound of the broken tether throbbed, echoing the brutal truth of the healer's assessment. The golden thread was gone. He could not command her return. The ancient laws of the fated mates dictated that a rejected bond could only be reforged through absolute, voluntary submission. "I was poisoned," Valerius gritted out, his voice thick with absolute agony. "My mind was not my own. But the rejection was," Gideon countered coldly. "The poison amplified your fears, Valerius, but it did not invent them. You allowed the court to convince you that her lack of a wolf made her a liability. You let their whispers build the foundation that the advisor exploited. Poison or no, you spoke the words. She accepted them. The sovereign king of Valdron, a man who had conquered armies and bowed to no god, suddenly found his knees giving out. Valerius collapsed onto the stone floor of the infirmary. The heavy impact rattled the wooden tables, sending a small glass vial crashing to the ground. He did not try to stand. He stayed kneeling, his broad shoulders shaking, his head bowed in absolute crushing defeat. The iron crown upon his brow had never looked so meaningless. "I am dying, Gideon," the king whispered to the floor, his voice cracking under the weight of his grief. "The Winterbane is consuming my beast, but I do not care about the curse. I do not care if the frost stops my heart by morning. I need to see her. I need to look into those silver eyes and apologize before the dark takes me." Gideon looked down at the broken monarch. For years he had served this man, fearing his volatile temper and his lethal power. To see him reduced to this, a weeping, kneeling penitent, was a stark testament to the absolute supremacy of the fated bond. "She will not return to a court built on lies," the healer warned softly. "She told me herself. She has built a sanctuary away from the Iron Crown." "Then I will leave the crown behind," Valerius replied instantly, lifting his head. His storm-grey eyes were wet, glowing with a raw, primal sincerity that eclipsed the madness of his beast. "I do not want her as a captive. I do not want her as a subject." The king reached up, his trembling fingers wrapping around the hilt of a small silver scalpel resting on the edge of the counter. Without a single second of hesitation, Valerius pressed the sharp blade against his own left palm and sliced deep. Dark, freezing blood welled to the surface, spilling onto the sterile white tiles. It hissed violently as the curse instantly began to freeze the droplets into solid red ice. "I swear by the moon goddess," he swore, his voice resonating with ancient, binding magic that shook the very foundations of the room. "I swear on the blood of my ancestors and the ice in my veins. I do not seek Evadne Thorn to command her. I do not seek her to force her return. I seek her only to kneel at her feet, to beg for her forgiveness, and to offer my life in exchange for the pain I caused. If she demands I walk away, I will turn my back and die in the snow." The blood oath hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. The ambient magic of the infirmary shimmered, acknowledging the supreme vulnerability of the sovereign's vow. Gideon Vance stared at the bleeding man. The royal healer's stern expression finally softened, replaced by a profound, heavy sorrow. He reached into the pocket of his dark robes and pulled out a small, folded piece of parchment, dropping it onto the counter near the king's uninjured hand. "The Whispering Frostwoods," Gideon said quietly, 3 miles north of the Black River, hidden at the base of the jagged ridge. There is an abandoned trapper's cabin. She masks her scent with dried wolfsbane, but you will not need your nose to find her. The woods will guide a dying wolf." Valerius stared at the parchment as if it were a holy relic. He reached out with his bloody hand, his scarred fingers trembling violently as he picked it up. He pressed the paper to his forehead, closing his eyes as a shuddering, broken breath escaped his lungs. "Thank you," the king whispered. He pushed himself up from the cold floor, his towering frame swaying slightly under the immense weight of the advancing curse. He did not bother to bandage his bleeding hand. He did not bother to summon his guards or issue any final decrees to his fractured council. The Obsidian Keep, with all its political machinations, grand altars, and treacherous courts, no longer mattered in the slightest. King Valerius turned his back on his own fortress and walked toward the northern gates, stepping out into the brutal, howling dark of the winter night, a solitary beast hunting for the only warmth left in the world. The whispering frostwoods did not care that he was a king. To the ancient, twisting pines and the fathomless drifts of snow, he was merely another dying animal bleeding out in the dark. The ambient temperature of the northern peaks was already lethal, but the true freezing came from within. The jagged scar over his heart pulsed with a necrotic, icy blue light. With every step King Valerius took through the knee-deep snow, the curse sank its teeth deeper into his chest cavity, attempting to stop his heart entirely. Frost formed on his eyelashes. His breath left his lungs in ragged, shallow clouds of white vapor that instantly crystallized in the bitter wind. He wore only a thin linen tunic and leather breeches, having abandoned the heavy iron armor of the palace hours ago. The cold bit into his exposed skin like 1,000 tiny blades, sliding beneath his flesh to freeze the marrow in his bones, but the physical agony was entirely eclipsed by the psychological devastation of his own making. He was hunting for a ghost. For 3 grueling hours, the Alpha King pushed his massive frame through the unforgiving wilderness. The blood from the deep slice in his left palm had frozen solid, a grotesque icicle of raw red hanging from his knuckles. He did not feel it. His storm-grey eyes, usually sharp enough to track a falcon in flight, were clouded with the sheer pain of the biological separation. The sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding, had been severed by his own cruel words at the grand altar. Now the void left behind was an absolute vacuum, sucking the life from his massive heart. Then the moon breached the jagged peaks. It was a massive silver orb, casting a stark, blinding luminescence over the dead world. The moment the light touched his skin, the Winterbane brand erupted. It was not a dull ache. It was a violent, searing explosion of dry ice against his nerve endings, paralyzing his respiratory system and freezing the blood in his veins. Valerius collapsed. His knees hit the packed snow with a heavy thud that cracked the ice beneath him. He dug his scarred fingers into the frozen earth, his jaw locking as a guttural, scraped raw groan tore through his throat. His inner beast, poisoned by lies and now suffocating in complete isolation, whimpered in the dark. It was dying. He was dying. And as the absolute cold consumed his senses, the terrifying monarch of Valdron knew, with perfect clarity, that he deserved it. He forced his heavy head up, his vision swimming with jagged fractal frost. Through the dense, twisted trunks of the pine trees, a faint, unnatural glow caught his eye. It was not the cold, unforgiving silver of the moon. It was the heavy, burning gold of a hearth fire. The scent hit him a moment later. It was buried meticulously beneath layers of bitter wolfsbane and crushed sage, a deliberate, desperate camouflage. But to a fated mate, the underlying biological truth could not be masked by herbs or distance. There, beneath the sharp medicinal tang, was the delicate, unmistakable aroma of moonflowers. Evadne, a name unspoken for 3 years, grew teeth in his chest. Meanwhile, inside the small timber cabin, the atmosphere shifted with violent suddenness. Evadne Thorne stood before the stone hearth, her scarred hands paused over a bundle of dried yarrow. The firelight cast warm, golden shadows across the rough-hewn walls, a stark contrast to the absolute brutality of the world outside. She had built a sanctuary out of silence. She had learned to survive the crushing isolation of the high country frost, tending to her quiet life without shedding a single tear for the crown. 3 winters had passed since she had walked away from the grand altar. 3 brutal, freezing winters of hiding her true bloodline and surviving on sheer, uncompromising willpower. She was no longer alone in the dark. In the low, sturdy cot pulled close to the warmth of the hearth, 2 small figures slept tangled in thick furs, a boy and a girl, barely 3 years old, their soft, rhythmic breathing the only sound in the quiet cabin. They were her entire world, the secret, unacknowledged heirs of Valdron, hidden away from the treacherous politics of the court. But biology was absolute, without warning. The phantom scar over Evadne's heart violently ruptured. Evadne gasped, dropping the herbs into the flames. Her hands flew to her chest, her fingers clutching the thick wool of her tunic as she staggered backward. It was not the dull, persistent throbbing she had endured since the winter solstice 3 years ago. This was a sudden, searing tear, as if the invisible claiming mark was trying to knit itself back together with a rusted, burning needle. The physical burning of a mating mark was supposed to be a romantic metaphor. It was not. It was a brutal biological reality designed to bring wolves to their knees. It radiated outward from her sternum, flooding her veins with liquid fire and suffocating heat. It felt wrong. Everything felt fundamentally biologically wrong. In the cot, the twins stirred instantly, ripped from their sleep by the sheer magnitude of the magical disturbance. The little boy sat up, his small hands clutching the furs, a surge of latent alpha magic responding to the sudden, drastic atmospheric pressure shift in the room. His storm-grey eyes, so agonizingly identical to the man who had cast them out, widened in the dark. Beside him, his sister whimpered, her tiny hands reaching for Evadne as the crushing weight in the air pressed down on them. Evadne squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the intense wave of nausea that threatened to drop her to the floorboards. The air in the small cabin grew impossibly thick, heavy with the terrifying scent of ozone, raw iron, and freezing pine. It was the scent of a storm about to break over the mountains. She recognized that scent immediately. It was the atmospheric weight of a sovereign. He was here. The realization did not bring relief, nor did it bring tears. It brought a terrifying spike of pure adrenaline. Evadne forced her knees to lock, refusing to collapse into the dust. She turned toward the heavy wooden door, her breathing shallow, measured, and entirely controlled. She reached for the small, unadorned silver dagger resting on the oak table, a parting gift from Gideon, her knuckles going white as she gripped the cold hilt. She did not know why the Alpha King had tracked her through the deadly storm after 3 years of silence. She did not know if the matriarch had sent him to finish the execution, or if the madness of the curse had driven him to hunt her down for a final violent confrontation. All she knew was that she would not beg. She had bowed once at the altar. She would never bow again. A heavy, desperate thud sounded against the timber. It was not a knock. It was the sound of a massive, failing body giving out against the wood. Evadne stepped forward. Her spine was entirely straight, her chin lifted in flawless, defensive dignity. She pulled the heavy iron latch back and opened the door to the howling wind. Valerius Draconus was buried in the snow. The Alpha King, the most lethal predator in the 7 realms, was kneeling on the freezing earth. His broad, heavily muscled shoulders were bowed, his massive head resting heavily against the rough wood of the doorframe. The frost had completely overtaken his linen tunic, turning the fabric into a rigid shell of ice that cracked with his shallow breaths. The Winterbane brand pulsed visibly through the material, a sickly, blinding blue that illuminated the darkness around him with a necrotic aura. His skin was deathly pale, his lips tinted with the dark blue of advanced hypothermia. The moment their eyes met, the magical feedback loop detonated. The sudden physical proximity of the true mates triggered a catastrophic reaction within their fractured bond. The severed threads of their souls, desperate to reconnect and heal the biological trauma, reached for each other across the 3 feet of space separating them. But the bond had been formally rejected. It could not simply heal without absolute, voluntary consent from the injured party. The resulting friction was a violent, agonizing shockwave of clashing, ancient magic. Blinding heat slammed into abyssal cold. The collision of their auras created an atmospheric pressure so intense that the dead pine needles on the ground around them instantly vaporized into fine grey ash. Valerius roared, the sound tearing from his throat in a spray of white vapor and raw blood. He gripped his own chest, his iron-clad muscles seizing violently as the feedback loop ripped through his central nervous system, forcing him lower into the snow. Evadne staggered backward, her vision going completely white for a terrifying heartbeat. The phantom wound on her chest burned with the intensity of a branding iron, pressed directly to her skin. She gritted her teeth, locking her jaw to trap the scream in her throat. She would not cry out. She would not show him a single ounce of weakness. The massive predator did not try to cross the threshold. He did not reach for her. He remembered the devastation he had caused, and he forced his massive, trembling hands to remain planted in the snow, his knuckles burying deep into the frozen dirt to anchor himself against the overwhelming biological pull to claim her. Evadne, he rasped. His voice was a hollow, broken scrape of sound, entirely devoid of a sovereign's absolute command. I do not ask to enter. I do not ask you to return. She looked down at him, her grip on the silver dagger unwavering. Her strange silver eyes were clear, reflecting the golden embers from the hearth behind her. She saw the bleeding slice on his palm. She saw the devastating, lethal toll of the Winterbane ravaging his immortal body. He was a terrifying, dangerous protector who had been brought entirely, willingly to his knees at her door. "Then why are you here, Valerius?" she asked. Her voice was cold iron, betraying absolutely none of the physical agony tearing through her chest. He lifted his heavy head. His storm-grey eyes were wet, glowing with a raw, primal grief that cracked the frozen, untouchable mask of his face. He looked up, and for the first time, his gaze dropped from her face to the shadows of the cabin floor. Peering nervously from behind the heavy folds of Evadne's thick woolen skirts were two small figures. The little boy stared back at the massive, bleeding predator in the snow with wide, storm-grey eyes. The little girl hid her face in the wool, her raven hair catching the golden embers of the fire. A visceral, biological recognition flashed across the king's pallid features. The scent of his own bloodline, pure and unmistakable, hit him like a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat. The sovereign realized, in a singular shattering moment of clarity, the absolute magnitude of what he had cast away. His children, his heirs, he had missed their births. He had missed their first steps, their first words, the entirety of their short lives, leaving them to freeze in the high country dark while he sat on a throne built on lies. "I was poisoned," Valerius whispered, the confession bleeding out of him like venom from a fatal wound, his gaze entirely locked on the children who possessed his exact features. Gideon found the Moonstone Vial. Lady Morveth used the soul fracture on me. It blinded my wolf, it twisted my instincts and made me believe you were a lethal threat to the realm. I thought I was protecting the crown by letting you go. But my human mind should have known. I should have fought the venom. I should have trusted the quiet hands that held my monstrous soul. He bowed his head, his forehead pressing against the ice-covered stoop of her sanctuary, utterly defeated. I was wrong. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry, Evadne. I came only to tell you the truth, and to atone. Evadne stared at the kneeling monarch. The heavy, dramatic irony of the past 3 years settled over the frozen landscape. He had not betrayed her out of malice or political ambition. He had been manipulated, chemically blinded by the very treacherous court she had always despised. But the revelation did not instantly mend the shattered glass of her trust. A sudden apology, no matter how desperate, did not erase the months of solitary survival, the freezing nights, the constant terror of the royal hunters, or the agonizing loneliness of giving birth in the snow. "You broke the bond, Valerius," she said quietly, her voice steady against the howling wind. "Poison or no, you stood at the altar and spoke the words. I cannot simply stitch the sacred thread back together because you finally realized you are bleeding without me." "I know," he choked out, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his suppressed sobs. "I do not expect forgiveness. I expect nothing. Just let me stay in the snow. Let me freeze at your door, so that my beast can at least die, knowing it is guarding your threshold." Before Evadne could process the absolute submission of the man before her, the ambient geometry of the woods shifted with violent, terrifying abruptness. The wind changed direction, carrying a scent that made her blood run entirely cold. It was not pine. It was not ozone. It was the cloying, suffocating aroma of poisoned honey and crushed dark petals. Cailannis Morvath had not walked out the eastern gates alone. The disgraced advisor stepped out from the dense tree line, 30 yards from the cabin. She was no longer wearing the elegant grey velvet of the capital's court. She wore the heavy, dark leathers of a rogue commander, her ruined, blackened right hand, rotted by her arrogant attempt to replicate a mate's warmth, strapped tightly to her chest with dirty linen. Behind her, the shadows of the whispering frostwoods detached themselves from the darkness. 8 massive, feral wolves stepped into the moonlight. Their pelts were matted with freezing mud, and their eyes glowed with a toxic, unnatural yellow light. They were sentinels of the matriarch's hidden lineage, assassins bred in the dark and bound by ancient, forbidden blood magic. If the king dies to rogue beasts in the wilderness, the council will have no choice but to reinstate me to guide the transition. Lady Morvath's voice echoed across the snow, sharp and beautiful in the way a winter frost was beautiful. And the wolfless maid, along with her bastard spawns, will simply be a tragic casualty of the storm. She smiled, a polite, frozen expression of absolute malice. Kill them all. The first arrow did not come from a bow, but from a specialized heavy crossbow, wielded by one of the assassins in human form. It punched through the freezing air with a lethal hiss, aimed directly at Evadne's chest. Valerius moved with supernatural speed. Despite the agonizing freeze of the Winterbane, despite the catastrophic feedback loop tearing through his nervous system, the Sovereign's protective instincts completely overrode his failing biology. He lunged upward from his knees, a massive blur of dark muscle and ice. He threw his towering body in front of Evadne and the twins, shoving them backward into the safety of the cabin, just as the heavy iron bolt buried itself deep into his right shoulder. With a sickening crunch, the Alpha let out a guttural snarl, the impact spinning him around, but he did not fall. His massive boots dug into the floorboards, splintering the wood as he arrested his momentum. He used his massive frame to completely block the doorway, shielding his true mate and his born children with his own flesh. Glass from the small adjacent window exploded inward as a second bolt shattered the pane, raining sharp, glittering shards across the wooden floorboards. "Stay down," Valerius roared over his shoulder, his voice finally reclaiming its terrifying, sovereign resonance, shaking the very timber of the roof. He reached up with his left hand, gripping the shaft of the crossbow bolt, lodged in his shoulder, and snapped the thick wood with a violent, sickening twist of his wrist. He tossed the broken shaft into the snow. His storm-grey eyes shifted to molten, burning gold as his inner beast fought frantically to break through the paralyzing ice of the curse. He was going to transform. He was going to tear the traitor's assassins apart with his bare teeth, even if the immense biological exertion stopped his freezing heart in the process. But the Winterbane would not allow it. As his bones began to crack and shift for the transformation, the curse flared with absolute ancient malice. The icy blue light of the brand expanded rapidly across his chest, locking his muscles in a rigid, agonizing paralysis. Valerius dropped to one knee, coughing up a heavy spatter of dark, freezing blood onto the pure white snow. He was a god of war, chained by his own bloodline, entirely incapacitated by the very magic he had come to the woods to escape. The rogue wolves realized his critical weakness immediately. They lunged forward, closing the distance to the cabin in a synchronized, lethal pack formation, their massive jaws snapping for the kill. Evadne Thorn did not scream. She did not drop her silver dagger, and she did not cower behind the dying king. Gideon had once warned her that they were small things in a world of teeth. For her entire life, she had believed him. She had been told she was a wolfless nothing, a quiet, hollow maid whose only value was her ability to scrub blood from the altar and grind roots in the dark. She had accepted this lie to survive the brutal politics of the keep. She had suppressed the ancient, vibrating truth in her veins, because to reveal it in the obsidian keep would have meant immediate execution by a paranoid court. But she was no longer in the keep, and she would absolutely not let the penitent Alpha, who had crawled across the ice to beg for her forgiveness, be slaughtered on her threshold while her children watched. Evadne stepped forward, moving past the kneeling, paralyzed mass of the Alpha King. She stepped out into the brutal cold, placing herself directly between Valerius and the charging pack. The presence of her children, their pure Alpha lineage radiating behind her, acted as the final, necessary catalyst. The phantom wound on her chest, which had been burning with the pain of the torn link, suddenly inverted. The pain vanished entirely, replaced by an overwhelming volcanic pressure building in her lungs. Evadne lifted her scarred hands toward the night sky. She did not chant highborn runes. She did not use volcanic embers or dark rituals. She drew upon the pure, instinctual power of the Starlight lineage, a royal bloodline older than the Iron Crown itself, pulsing wildly in her blood. A blinding, searing shockwave of heavy golden light erupted from her center. It was a light that tasted of ozone and ancient fire, carrying the crushing atmospheric weight of a supreme sovereign. The golden shockwave blasted outward in a perfect, rapidly expanding dome. It hit the charging rogue wolves with the force of a solid physical wall. The massive beasts were thrown backward through the air, their unnatural yellow eyes widening in absolute terror, as the golden fire singed their matted fur and drove the dark magic entirely from their blood. The snow beneath them instantly melted into steam, turning the frozen earth into a boiling crater of wet mud. The shockwave hit Kaelenis Morvath next. The matriarch screamed, raising her ruined arm to shield her face, but the ancient magic did not care for her political defenses or her amulets. The golden light shattered the protective wards hidden beneath her leathers, knocking her violently backward into the deep snow drifts, leaving her gasping, scorched, and momentarily blinded by the sheer holy radiance. The golden dome held steady, pushing the freezing wind and the falling snow away, creating an impenetrable sphere of absolute, burning warmth around the cabin. It was the warmth of a true mate's soul, unfiltered and unyielding. Within the dome, the delicate frost fractals on the timber walls instantly melted, dripping harmlessly to the ground. The lethal frost clinging to Valerius's tunic dissolved into warm vapor, easing the paralyzing grip of the Winterbane brand. Evadne lowered her hands, her breathing heavy but perfectly controlled. Her dark hair whipped around her face in the residual wind, and her strange silver eyes glowed with a terrifying ethereal light. She stood before the howling wilderness, a weapon of ancient light fully awakened, protecting the king who had once thrown her away, shielding the tiny heirs who clung to her skirts. But beyond the golden barrier, Lady Morvath slowly, painfully pulled herself from the snowdrifts. Her surviving sentinels circled the perimeter of the light, their eyes filled with a new, ravenous fury. The ambush had failed to kill them in their sleep, but the long night was far from over. Thank you for joining our sanctuary tonight. When Evadne stood at that frozen threshold and refused to yield, she chose her own dignity over a broken bond. But with the truth of the Moonstone Vial finally revealed, do you think King Valerius deserves her forgiveness? Or should the sovereign be left in the snow to pay for his devastating mistake? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you felt the warmth of this story, please take 2 seconds to like and subscribe to keep our hearth fire burning. The rogue sentinels did not retreat. Lady Morvath's desperate, furious scream echoed through the frozen timberline, driving the feral beasts forward. They hit the edge of the golden barrier with bone-crushing force, their massive claws tearing at the starlight magic. The dome flickered. Evadne's breath hitched, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as the sheer physical toll of maintaining the ancient ward crashed down on her wolfless biology. Her scarred hands trembled. The golden light wavered, dimming just enough to let the biting winter wind slip back through the cracks. The ambient temperature inside the sanctuary immediately dropped, the branching icy tendrils instantly beginning to reform along the rough-hewn timber walls. Valerius felt the deadly chill returning. The Alpha King was bleeding heavily from the crossbow wound in his shoulder, his dark blood staining the pure white snow beneath his heavy boots. The Winterbane brands still pulsed with a sickly, necrotic blue light beneath his torn linen tunic, fighting a brutal, losing war against the fading warmth of the dome. He was operating on the absolute brink of physiological collapse. His inner beast, battered by the curse, and the agonizing feedback of their fractured tie, was practically suffocating. Every breath he took felt like inhaling crushed glass, yet the Sovereign forced himself to stand. He did not summon his feral strength to go on the offensive. He knew with absolute certainty that unleashing his cursed ice to fight would shatter the fragile golden barrier she was holding. He would not risk extinguishing her light. He would not let the lethal frost of his own bloodline harm the children cowering behind her. Instead, the terrifying monarch of Valdron chose to become a simple, physical wall of flesh and bone. The first rogue wolf broke through the weakened perimeter of the dome, its unnatural yellow eyes locked on the twins huddled in the doorway. Valerius intercepted the beast mid-leap. He did not use his claws. He simply absorbed the massive impact, wrapping his heavily muscled arms around the creature's neck and driving it into the frozen earth. The wolf's jaws snapped, tearing a brutal gash across his forearm. Valerius didn't flinch. He didn't roar. He clamped his hands down, snapping the assassin's neck with a singular, sickening twist of raw, physical leverage. His storm-grey eyes were completely devoid of the Sovereign's usual fury. They held only the cold, mechanical focus of a shield. Two more shadows breached the golden light. They hit the king simultaneously, their fangs sinking deep into his thighs and his uninjured shoulder. The impact drove Valerius back onto one knee. The physical agony was immense, layered over the deep, bone-chilling freeze of his generational curse, but he refused to fall. He wrapped his massive hands into their matted fur, holding them entirely focused on him, keeping their lethal teeth away from the woman, standing a few feet behind him. He was not fighting to win the kingdom back. He was not fighting to reclaim his pride or to enforce a fated mandate. He was fighting to buy her time. Evadne watched him bleed. She stood at the epicenter of the fading starlight, her silver eyes tracking the brutal, silent sacrifice of the warrior who had once broken her world. The heavy, dramatic irony of the moment pressed down on her chest. This was not the poisoned sovereign who had stood at the grand altar of the Obsidian Keep. This was not the arrogant ruler who had allowed his mind to be twisted by a manipulative court. This was the true Valerius Draconis, a penitent, desperate protector who was willingly allowing himself to be torn apart, rather than risk harming her sanctuary. He was systematically absorbing every ounce of physical punishment the assassins could deliver, just to keep the space around her safe. He looked back at her over his bleeding shoulder. His storm-grey eyes were dimming, clouded by severe blood loss and the rapid advancement of the Winterbane freeze, but they held absolutely no expectation. He was not asking to be saved. He was not demanding her intervention. He was simply guarding the threshold, ready to die in the mud to pay his debt. A profound, shattering clarity washed over Evadne's soul. She had spent 3 years building a fortress of ice around her heart, convincing herself that survival meant absolute isolation. She had accepted the public rejection with flawless dignity, determined to prove that she did not need the sacred thread to exist. She had been proud of her cold, untouched independence, but looking at the dying beast in the snow, the quiet realization bloomed in her chest. True strength did not lie in remaining forever stoic and untouched. True sovereign power was the absolute vulnerability required to choose love again, even after the world had burned you. Evadne lowered her trembling arms. She did not let the golden dome collapse. Instead, she drew the ancient magic entirely inward. The heavy, burning gold of the starlight lineage condensed, pulling back from the perimeter of the clearing and gathering in the center of her chest, right over the phantom wound of her severed mark. The air in the cabin grew instantly dense, suffocatingly thick with the aroma of ozone and blooming moonflowers. The ambient pressure spiked, humming with a frequency that made the floorboards vibrate. She stepped out into the snow. She walked directly into the chaotic, violent melee with a straight spine and zero hesitation. A rogue wolf lunged at her, its jaws wide, but before it could cross the final yard, Valerius surged upward. He grabbed the beast by the throat, hurling it backward with the last desperate reserve of his strength, before collapsing heavily at her feet. His massive frame hit the frozen dirt, his breathing reduced to a shallow, freezing rattle. Evadne knelt in the freezing mud beside him. She did not speak, she did not hesitate. She pressed her bare, calloused hands directly over the jagged, icy scar of the Winterbane brand on his chest. The physical contact was explosive. The moment her skin touched the cursed frost, the stored starlight magic detonated. A blinding, searing pillar of pure, liquid gold erupted from their joined bodies, shooting upward into the dark winter sky. The shockwave was absolute and terrifying. It did not just push the remaining rogue wolves away. It disintegrated the dark blood magic animating them. The feral beasts whimpered, their unnatural yellow eyes burning out as they turned and fled into the deep woods, entirely broken by the supreme holy radiance. Lady Morveth shrieked, shielding her eyes as the wave of pure heat slammed into her. The disgraced advisor was thrown backward into the snowdrifts, her dark leathers smoking. The toxic magic in her veins literally boiled under the overwhelming purity of the lunar energy, stripping away her high-born protections. She scrambled to her feet, a pathetic, banished shadow of a matriarch, and ran blindly into the howling wilderness, knowing she would never possess the power to threaten them again. Within the pillar of light, the biological reality of the curse was unwritten. Valerius gasped, his massive chest arching off the snow. The excruciating, searing agony of the dry ice melted beneath her palms. The necrotic blue light of the brand flickered, fractured, and then vanished completely. Evadne felt the intricate freezing webs receding from his collarbones, replaced by a sudden, intense rush of physiological heat. For the first time in generations, the generational punishment of the Draconess bloodline was permanently silenced. The slush in his veins turned back into warm, heavy, pulsing blood. The violent shivering stopped. He stared up at her, his storm-grey eyes perfectly clear, vibrating with absolute awe and desperate reverence. "Evadne," he breathed. The word was a prayer, carrying the full, unburdened weight of a healed soul. "I choose you," she whispered, her silver eyes bright with the unshed tears that she finally, willingly allowed to fall. She didn't cry for the pain of the past. She cried for the relief of the present. Not used, not owned, chosen. "I choose you because you crawled through the dark to find us, and you did not ask for a single thing in return." The invisible claiming mark over her heart knitted itself back together, not with the burning agony of a forced bond, but with a deep, resonant warmth that settled into her very bones. The winter wind howled around them, but in the center of the starlight, there was only the steady, harmonious heartbeat of two isolated solitudes finally made whole. The thawing of the whispering frostwoods did not happen overnight, but the immediate vicinity of the abandoned trapper's cabin had been fundamentally altered. The snowdrifts surrounding the perimeter had melted into a soft, damp earth, smelling richly of pine needles and fresh soil. The lethal, biting edge of the winter wind had been pushed back, replaced by a strange, localized pocket of heavy, golden warmth that lingered in the air like a protective blanket. King Valerius sat on the edge of the wooden stoop, his massive frame hunched forward, his forearms resting on his knees. He was covered in dried blood, his linen tunic torn to shreds, and his dark hair was matted with sweat and dirt. He looked nothing like the immaculate, terrifying Alpha King of the realm. He looked like a man who had survived the end of the world. He was staring at his own hands. For his entire life, his touch had carried the freezing agony of the Winterbane brand. He had spent decades measuring the exact distance he needed to keep, between himself and the rest of the world, to avoid causing pain. Now, his skin was simply warm. The unnatural, necrotic chill was gone. The jagged scar over his heart remained as a physical testament to his survival, but it was just pale, unblemished tissue. It no longer pulsed. It no longer dictated his fate. The heavy wooden door opened behind him. Evadne stepped out onto the stoop. She carried a steaming wooden mug of steeped yarrow and dried clove, the scent of the medicinal broth mixing perfectly with her natural aroma of moonflowers. She had washed the ash and mud from her face, her striking silver eyes soft and unguarded in the early morning light. She did not wear the heavy, impractical silver silk of a courtly bride. She wore a simple, practical woolen dress, her scarred hands moving with the quiet, effortless grace that had always anchored his soul. She sat down beside him on the rough timber, entirely unbothered by the dirt and blood covering his body. She pressed the warm mug into his hands. Valerius took the cup, his large fingers carefully wrapping around hers for a fraction of a second. The contact was deliberately slow, a micro-tactile gesture of immense self-restraint. He was still terrified of breaking the fragile peace they had just forged. The heat of her skin against his was a sensory revelation. It did not burn. It did not freeze. It simply felt like coming home. "The children are sleeping," Evadne said quietly, her voice a soothing murmur against the quiet backdrop of the forest. "The magic exhausted them. They will likely sleep until dusk." "They are beautiful," Valerius replied, his voice rough with emotion. He stared into the swirling broth, unable to fully meet her eyes. The crushing weight of the years he had missed with his twins still pressed heavily on his conscience. "They have your quiet strength. I can already see it. They have your eyes." "Valerius," she corrected gently, taking a small sip from her own cup. "And your stubborn refusal to stay down when the odds are entirely against you." Before the king could respond, the sound of boots crunching on the distant, unbroken snow broke the quiet intimacy of the morning. From the dense tree line to the south, a solitary figure emerged. The royal healer walked with a heavy, exhausted limp, leaning heavily on a carved wooden walking staff. Gideon Vance had tracked the chaotic trail of the sovereign through the night, fully expecting to find a frozen corpse in the snow. His dark robes were travel-stained, and his face was lined with deep, unyielding fatigue. Gideon stopped 10 paces from the cabin. He looked at the melted snow, the scorched earth where the rogue wolves had been disintegrated, and the residual golden shimmer of starlight magic that still clung to the timber walls. Then, his dark eyes moved to the stoop. He saw the Alpha King sitting beside the wolfless maid, their shoulders nearly touching, a shared, silent harmony vibrating between them. The old healer let out a long, shuddering breath, resting his weight on his staff. "I see the medical texts were entirely insufficient in their predictions regarding the Winterbane," he noted dryly, though the profound relief in his voice was unmistakable. "The texts did not account for her, Gideon," Valerius said, his voice carrying a quiet, resonant authority. He set his mug down on the wooden planks and stood up. The massive predator moved toward the healer, his posture shifting. He did not project the terrifying, dominating aura of a monarch demanding a report. He moved with the deliberate, heavy steps of a man who had finally realized the true weight of his crown. Valerius stopped in front of Gideon. He reached into the pocket of his leather breeches and pulled out a heavy, intricately carved iron signet ring, the absolute symbol of the Alpha King's authority over the realm of Valdron. He held it out. "My king," Gideon said, his brow furrowing in confusion. He did not reach for the ring. "Byssus, the court is in chaos. With Morvath banished, the lesser lords are already beginning to fracture the territories. They require their sovereign to return and establish order." "The court requires a regent," Valerius corrected, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "They require a man who understands the truth of the ancient texts, a man who cannot be poisoned by political ambition or manipulated by forged ledgers. They require you, Gideon." The healer stared at the iron signet. "You are abdicating? I am stepping aside," the king clarified, his storm-grey eyes glancing back toward the cabin where Evadne sat watching them. I spent my entire life prioritizing the political duties of the crown. I allowed the whispers of the nobility to dictate the value of my own mate. I wore the crown, but it made me a blind, easily manipulated fool. I will not make that mistake again. Valerius reached out, pressing the heavy iron ring firmly into Gideon's calloused palm. Take the seal back to Valdron, restore order, purge the archives of Morvath's toxic influence, the Alpha commanded softly. Tell the council that their king remains in the Whispering Frostwoods. I have 3 years of trust to rebuild. I have a son and a daughter who do not know the sound of my voice. I will not return to the high towers until I have proven myself worthy of the family I cast away. Gideon looked down at the ring, the immense weight of the kingdom suddenly resting in his stained hands. He looked up at Valerius, and for the first time in his long life, the royal healer bowed entirely out of genuine, unforced respect. It shall be done, Valerius. The keep will be waiting when you are ready. The old man turned, pulling his heavy fur hood over his head, and began the long trek back toward the southern territories, leaving the isolated sanctuary behind. Valerius walked back to the stoop. He sat back down beside Evadne, the absence of the iron signet ring on his finger, making his hand feel strangely light. He had just handed away the absolute power of an empire, yet he had never felt more sovereign than he did in this quiet, dirt-stained moment. You did not have to give him the crown, Evadne said quietly, her silver eyes studying his profile. I did, Valerius replied, turning to look at her. The Obsidian Keep was built to humble people like us. It was a fortress where the weak went to be forgotten. I cannot ask you to bring our children back to a place that only knows how to tear things apart. We will stay here, in the sanctuary you built. And when the time is right, we will build a new court, one anchored by warmth, not iron. Evadne did not argue. She simply leaned her head against his broad shoulder. Valerius went entirely still, his breath catching in his throat at the voluntary, absolute trust of the gesture. He slowly, carefully lifted his arm, wrapping it around her shoulders and pulling her closer to his side. The physical proximity was a sensory anchor. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling the deep, resonant scent of moonflowers that finally truly belonged to him. Hours passed in quiet, domestic peace. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and burning orange, and then the silver edge of the full moon breached the horizon. For 3 years, the moonrise had been a time of absolute terror for the Alpha King. It was the exact moment the Winterbane brand would erupt, a daily reminder of the severed bond and the horrific mistake he had made at the altar. Valerius instinctively braced himself, his muscles tensing as the silver light touched his skin, but the agony never came. Instead of the searing, necrotic freeze, the moonlight simply illuminated the golden embers of the hearth fire, spilling from the open cabin door. The phantom scar over his heart remained quiet. The moonrise no longer brought the excruciating punishment of the curse. It only brought a quiet, healing warmth, a gentle illumination of the sanctuaries they'd had fought so desperately to protect. They sat together in the silver light, watching the forest settle into the night. I never thought I would have this, Valerius whispered into the quiet dark, his voice thick with a profound, humbling gratitude. A mate. A family. I spent my whole life preparing to die alone in the ice, convinced that love was a luxury my bloodline could never afford. Evadne turned her face slightly, her cheek resting against his chest, directly over the faded scar of the curse. She could hear the strong, steady rhythm of his heart. The ice always thaws eventually, Valerius, she murmured, her scarred fingers gently tracing the unblemished skin of his arm. You just have to be willing to sit in the cold long enough to find the fire. He closed his eyes, resting his chin on the top of her head. He was no longer a terrified beast chained to a bed, nor was he an arrogant monarch blinded by poison. He was simply a man who had crawled through the dark, found his true north, and finally learned how to breathe. Thank you for joining our sanctuary tonight. When Evadne unleashed the starlight magic, she didn't just save a dying king. She rewrote the fate of an entire bloodline. Do you think Valerius made the right choice by handing his crown to Gideon to stay in the woods, or should he have returned immediately to punish the treacherous court? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you believe that true power lies in the vulnerability to choose love over duty, please take 2 seconds to like this video and subscribe to keep our hearth fire burning.